Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode in the Atomic Podcast. Today, I'm extremely excited and also really interested in the conversation about to occur between Bill Reed and I. Bill's going to give you background on himself, but one of the things that I've known for a very brief time is that Bill Reed is one of the founders of the LEED certification process. He'll give you some more details on that. But I think more importantly, he's really at the frontier of theory and practice in regenerative design and also in systems thinking that's really applied to people's real lives. And I mean just real lives in terms of living systems, systems that help us build the world, but also live a better life in that world. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to you, Bill, and give us a little sense of you.
Hey, thanks, Rodney. I don't know how deep to go, but give me the hook if I go a little too deep. I have been involved in the planning world and always wanted to be an architect. And I was turned on in the 8th grade to Lewis Mumford and Jane Jacobs. Why, I'm not quite sure, but a teacher figured that I was interested in that kind of stuff, and I really was. And I geeked out on that work. And my first paper was the sociological implications of urban and regional planning. And so I've had that focus since high school, but yet in college, planning didn't make any sense to me. It had no real purpose that I could see except moving cars around and geopolitical interests. So I became pretty jaundiced and just became a regular architect doing energy efficiency work. But it wasn't until the sustainability movement as a whole came along in the late 80s that I realized what had been missing from planning. And so my work since then has been focused on how do we actually embrace more and more of all the issues that are facing us as a whole living system, as a whole system. I didn't really understand the differentiation between mechanical systems and technical systems and living systems back then. But as we struggled with LEED, the rating system that we've developed to actually validate what green buildings purportedly we're trying to do, we realized that you just can't pick one or two or three criteria. You have to pick them all that were applicable. And then how do you work with multiple strategies and multiple consultants and getting out of the typical linear approach of design? And we developed the integrative process for green buildings that actually taught me a lot. And the fundamental question that we asked at the end of the book that we wrote on the subject is, where do we stop integrating? That gets to be a metaphysical question pretty quickly. And that's what led me to Regenesis, which started in 1994. I was giving a speech on integration at a conference, and they were there and said, you're onto something and we're onto something. We might want to talk. And their work was, I'm not one of the founders of Regenesis, but joined fairly soon after. Their work was centered around the idea of working with permaculture, which for those of you who don't know what that is, permanent agriculture. It's Australian Bill Mollison, David Holmgren found this as a way to, how do we actually work with soil, earth, food production in a way that supports a culture that is sustainable? And how do we work with the earth in a sustained way, which requires a whole systems approach. Now, that word whole systems, we'll get into this a little later on, that term. But, and then, so there were the early permaculturists in the United States were members of Regenesis, and also Pamela Mang and Bob Mang, who had worked with organizational psychology as a whole system, working with corporations as a whole living organism. And they thought, well, here we're working with people, and you guys, the permaculturists, are working with the land. It's still missing a whole. Why don't we put them together as a whole? And that was the birth of Regenesis. And so since 1994, we have been trying to figure out, how do you actually practice this? And with a fair amount of, beating our heads against the wall and becoming, getting bludgeoned, and we've learned a lot. And so, and we're still in the process of learning, but we at least have something that is repeatable and operable to offer the world. And that's the nature of our practice.
That's excellent. I want to kind of give you a little case. Now, it just kind of bubbled up from what you're saying. And I would love to talk to you about Mumford someday, a real
Yeah,
inspiration
cool.
for me. So the so there is a group, I'll call them Group A. That group is architects and planners and developers, and they're looking to build. It could be a residential community. Let's call it a residential community. Um, and then there's your group that is also tasked with building a residential community. Now, that community can have parks, can have all kinds of different dimensions to it. What would be a regenerative approach versus, say, something that's more typical in that
Good.
in that development sort of pathway?
Yeah, that's a useful question. So when we this confronts us all the time. We're hired. People hire us because, by the way, when we were founded, we thought NGOs and municipalities would be hiring us. Zero, zero. Who hired us were actually at-risk developers, riverboat gamblers types who basically were either tired of the legacy that they were leaving, realized that they could do better, or they were what we call the green dreamers, people that actually knew there could be a better way but had never done development before and had money to invest, or system actualizers was the other buyer class, people that actually were aware of systems thinking and how do you practice that with real estate. So, and my entry point is real estate because as an architect and planner, that made a lot of sense. That's my client base. So, what we do, what we tell architects and developers, and we now pretty rigorously qualify them for their interests, because if they're not aligned even around with a sense of what we're doing, it's a waste for both of our times. But the first thing we say is your project is not the project. If you're really concerned about sustainability and regeneration, and I use those terms as an equivalent because sustainability is impossible without working regeneratively. And we can unpack that a little later on. So we say your project is not the project. The system of life is the project. Now, if we understand how the system of life wants to work, because it works in very specific patterns in each unique place on the planet, then that informs our project, emerges out of that understanding. And that's a social, cultural, and ecological and economic understanding of those patterns. So then the project emerges, and the project, as a result, we have an average of about getting our site plans approved 18 months faster than competition, because we're working with the community. We're getting to know the community, and they're getting to know their own place in a new way, which allows for an incredible relationship building process to then inform a way of building in collaboration with each other. And but anyway, I think that's the simple answer is we start with the system. Now, the other aspect of this is we also are working in an integrative way. And by integrative, I mean that we are creating multiple parallel paths of discovery, analysis and discovery, and that is they're feeding into each other. And we are in nodes. So basically, people do research, analysis, and design. They come together and they talk about it, and they have more questions. Then they go out and work on those questions, and come together and talk about it. So it's a process of progressive approximation with all key players of the design process and community, if they're interested, engaging in that discovery. And that co-discovery process allows for incredible creativity to emerge that would not happen if we were working in our silos or working in a linear fashion.
Bill, I have a question. Goes back to the case A and B. When you talk about kind of cooperation and co-development, in the typical case A again, and your case B, who typically gets left out of that planning process, and who do you actually bring in?
In the typical A, who gets left out?
Yeah, and then who do you bring in your process?
Oh, these are fun questions. So often, well, one question that we ask architects is, how would you feel if the mechanical, electrical designer or engineer of the project was a co-designer with you on the project? So it's not even, and I've had the response over my dead body. So, there's a lack of interest of that co-creation. That pretty well disqualifies those people from participating. But so the first thing is how we engage the people that are part of. So we engage all chief consultants, if you will, all main consultants as co-creators in the project. That's one difference. Now the other is the community is often left out. And when we use community, by the way, I want to just qualify this for any developer who's listening. We don't ask people what they want, although we're told what they want. People always will volunteer that. But really what we're working with is how do you live? We ask people how they live, which is actually a self-recognition process where they're thinking about, well, I never really thought about this. By voting with my feet, I find out what is really more important to me. And that we often surprise ourselves by what we subliminally know is important. So we're inviting community members, we're inviting the banker. They don't usually come. We're inviting the contractor, we're inviting the builders. We have worked with design teams as large as 150 people, to give you an idea of how massive this could be, for multiple billion-dollar projects. And of course, I could checklist a whole bunch of people that you normally wouldn't include: archaeologists and ecologists and social activists and anthropologists. All those people become resources for the process. Now, for a $10 billion project, that's white noise. But the smaller the project, you don't have to have that level of complexity. You could have what we call specialist generalists. A landscape architect who's a civil engineer, mechanical engineers, electrical engineer. You can combine resources with people who are already integrating multiple threads of disciplines together to save money. So we're very conscious of money. And by the way, just simply doing an integrative process and allowing that co-creative process to happen and managing it in a very systematic way. We roadmap every meeting. So, and we also start, instead of with concepts or strategies. For instance, a lead project, you're starting with strategies. You do this thing, you get a point. You do this thing, you get a point. So when people ask for a lead goal building, let's say, they've already dictated specific or a range of strategies. We start with beliefs and philosophy and principles before we begin. And we will spend sometimes up to 2 months working on aligning purpose and beliefs with the core client group, the community, and the design team. And that allows us to save so much time, because most projects work along 2 steps forward, 3 steps forward. Oops, I didn't know we were doing that. 2 steps backwards and 3 steps forwards. Oops, back again. And basically our projects pretty much go seamlessly forward. And we save a significant amount of time just from that alone.
That's super interesting that even though you have this diverse participation, you have this kind of co-development among different types of expertise and people, that you actually have more efficient planning, more efficient sort of follow through. I find that really important that people hear that. There's something else that's sort of sneaky behind what you're saying. It's not about who is excluded or included in the typical case and then your case. But it sounds, and maybe you could speak to this, it sounds like the people that would typically be at the table, you help them think differently, more intricatively. And so that they're actually maybe doubling or tripling the way in which they think. And that saves an enormous amount of, I'll say, crosstalk, because the understanding is already there. Is that true?
That's true. In broad strokes, that's true. What we're also doing, not just with meeting management and disciplining ourselves with who meets who when and what kind of analyses and inputs are you providing the team so that more complex decisions can be addressed. We are, boy, I just had the thought just disappeared. Pull it back. It's funny.
Are you going to a higher level in the sense that,
here's what, sorry, Beck, yeah. Thank you. I got it. Yes, we're going to a different level. And the different level is that we're using systemic framework thinking to help us navigate new thinking. So we're pretty custom. We're almost hardwired into Neoplatonic logic, either or logic, right? And then so it's a what if, boom, the toggle flips, and then we're on to the next thing. Well, that isn't the way life works. It's multiple complex relationships going on. So systemic frameworks, and they've been around for thousands of years, 4,000, 3,000, 4,000 years. Plato, they used systemic frameworks. Bucky Fuller used systemic frameworks. Gurdjieff, Bennett. It's not really part of the academic world. Those frameworks are incredibly useful, just beginning to become inculcated in the academic world, because the academic world is full of basically reductionist thinking. So these systemic frameworks allow us, as they're a shorthand for holding complexity. And I just finished a project, working on a project, initial schematic master plan for a project in Brazil just 2 weeks ago. And we had the design team work through a systemic framework, and it was revelatory to them. And the fact that the developer came away and said, yeah, I know it's about the system. It's not about the project. It was like a revelation to him. It's about the system. Thank you. I mean, he was so appreciative but he said, I would never have discovered that if you'd told me that. It was working through and experiencing that system at work that taught him.
If I could digress a second, because there's so many wonderful ideas, but also I think useful applications. You bring up cybernetics, really important system thinking that kind of got piecemealed, after maybe the 80s.
Objectified, closed system work.
Exactly. And then, we inherit it in the form of machine learning, Bayesian analysis, analytics, and now AI. But the point I'm trying to make here is that in looking at that system thinking, it's super important to recognize that sort of binary process that a lot of people are socialized and educated into as engineers, and then to sort of have them hold complexity. And one way to do that I've experienced, and it's I have, I'll say, suffered through and had some successes in the same areas that you have, but they're applied to AI, is getting people to think more systemically, have them upstream, and very different people at the table, as well as those stakeholders that would be at the table, to think more holistically, so that we actually are solving the right problem.
Yeah.
And so that still is a challenge today, both in terms of your larger companies, but also smaller projects. But to see things more integratively and more upstream in a systems framework is super important in AI. And I wish it was more kind of almost like natural history of AI, but it's not. It's still something developing.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting subject, and I've never had the opportunity to talk about AI in this context. Not that I know a whole lot about it, but it may be useful to understand how we hold holes, and let's see how that applies to AI. So the simple analogy is I want to get to know Rodney. I do want to get to know Rodney, but if I went through the process of knowing you like we try to know our cities or our ecosystems, I would take your liver and kidneys and skeletal structure and DNA sequencing, and I would throw it in a bowl and stir it around. And do I get Rodney? No, as Russell Acuff says, you get a mess. So I don't get Rodney. There's something, and that's the mystery of life, of course, that none of us have an answer for, but or maybe most of us don't have an answer for. I certainly don't. Is that what I need to know to know Rodney is to know Rodney as a whole entity. Because if I dissect Rodney, you're no longer Rodney. You're a mass of organs. So how do I get to know Rodney? I get to know Rodney by seeing you in relationship with your partner, your kids, parents, colleagues, your dog, your cat, me. Those invisible relationships, I might add, those are energetic relationships, tell me more about Rodney than any of the parts and pieces. Does that make sense?
Makes a lot of sense.
So how do I identify Rodney? And what we do it naturally is we look for the essence of Rodney. Now, that term is not that popular in use, but advertisers use it. What's the essence of our customer? What's the essence of this organization? In Cambridge, the philosophers are using intrinsic nature. What's the intrinsic nature of this living entity. Now, Philip Goff wrote this very accessible book called Galileo's Error. I don't know if you've had a chance to read that, but it's fun because he says, you know what Galileo realized, and he considered Galileo one of the greatest philosophers out there, is that Galileo specifically ignored consciousness as something that we could work with. And so everything that Galileo worked with was what? Speed, mass, distance, basically relationship. He was working on the relationships of entities, not the entities themselves. What this work is about is how we work with wholes, and why it is so difficult is that we've been so taught to work on relationships, and that consciousness isn't analyzable because you're being conscious of your consciousness. Where's the empiricism there? But yet we know that every child coming out of her mother's womb is different than the other. Right away, there's a difference. What's that difference about? Edwin Land was commissioned to do a study. This is floating around on Instagram somewhere. When you're 4 years old, 98% of the children are geniuses. When you're 8 years old, it goes down to about 60%. When you're 15, about 15%. That essence, that genius that all of us come, I realize this is maybe not so, this is conjectural, but that genius that each of us comes out with gets beaten out of us as we try to navigate through life. And it's only when we're about 30, 35 years old, we think, I'm missing something. Who I really am, what I'm meant to do. And that's when this journey of self-discovery and recovering our essence starts to work. So I use that as just a sidebar to illustrate how important the core is for the unique core. Every whole has a unique consciousness and core that we actually would benefit us all to work with. Every place on the planet has a unique core. New Orleans is different than San Francisco. So why? We know it's different. We know it's fun why is New Orleans so attractive to some people? It has a unique character, a unique essence. And we better actually, if we're going to impose ourselves on this place, which is a living organism, we ought to know its uniqueness. And so our work really starts with understanding that uniqueness and identifying it and working with the people of a community to collaborate on understanding that uniqueness. Now, I know I'm going on too much here, but one more point is that uniqueness births potential. This is really an important point, is that we do not work with problems in our work. We work with potential. Life works with potential. That essence understanding of every individual has within it the DNA of potential. Nature always looks forward. If a hurricane comes through and destroys a city, nature doesn't go to the pub and cry in their beer about it. It just gets to work. Pioneering species, early succession species, mid-level succession species. It always, if you can anthropomorphize nature, is always looking forward. We actually find that we can harmonize incredible complexity by having everybody aim at what we want in the future, as opposed to the fragmented problem solving that we do that we think is so practical. And I want to point out that we've been working on the environmental issues for 50 years. It's only getting worse. And I think it will continue to get worse as long as we try to just simply solve problems. It's not that we should not solve problems. We need to solve them within the context of the essence of each place. All right. I hope this is all together.
No. You're hitting so many bells. I'm trying to. It's like a huge church organ or church for me of ideas. I just want to say though that you mentioned earlier the sort of relationship or perhaps difference between sustainability and regenerative design and approach. Maybe could you unpack that a little bit more, and also perhaps unpack it in a way in which we can get even another angle on the understanding of working with potential versus problems?
Yeah, good. Well, sustainability as it's practiced today, and I'll use the word as it's being practiced, not as its aspirational term. So I actually like the term. A lot of people hate it because, do you want to have a, Bill McDonough says, do you want to have a sustainable marriage? Is that enough? But, and Bill also says sustainability is a slower way to die. So why is that? And he's right. As it's practiced today, we're making things more efficient. So let's say we take an ASHRAE 90.1 performance number for energy in a building, and we say, well, I can do 70% better. Well, that still leaves 30% of carbon output on the table. So you're just slowing down the degradation. You're not stopping it. And let's go to stopping it now. Net zero, that's the big thing these days. Net zero. So you're stopping it. Well, how does that help the degradation that is already happening in so many other sectors? Plastics in the ocean, pollution in the water. You can't drink the rain anymore. So we have all sorts of problems, how we're treating species. Working on the carbon problem on its own is wildly insufficient. That's problem solving. And we are abandoning, what do they call it? Exponential discounting. You work on the problem right in front of you that's easily accessible, and you just discount the rest. And so we are discounting all those other problems when we focus on carbon. We actually need to work on the system together as a whole if we're going to get somewhere. So we solve the carbon problem with cold fusion right now, today. Spreads around, it's easily accessible, easily manufacturable. We will still be destroying the planet, or we'll be destroying the living systems that support us on the planet. So that's sustainability. It's a slower way to die. It's reducing the damage in certain sectors. Let's go past the sustainability movement now into restoration. I think this is an important distinction between restoration and regeneration. Restoration means that we are restoring an ecological subsystem, a beach dune system, a wetland, a riparian corridor, a forest. So we're restoring that ecological subsystem so that it has the self-organizing capability to evolve. That's what we're doing. We're creating a critical mass of life that will get it on, basically. And that requires diversity of species and diversity of relationships. So let's actually pause for a moment. What are we sustaining with sustainability? We're actually trying to sustain life. So why don't we work with life on its own terms? So what is life? The simplest definition of life is the process of becoming. Life is evolutionary. And in order for life to evolve, it requires a critical mass of species and species relationships. And I make that distinction because, as Joel Glansberg in our office says, a zoo has lots of species, but it has no species relationships. So it's a dead zone, right? And so isolating species doesn't work either. You have to actually have incredible cross-fertilization to allow the ecological niches to be filled, to actually create dynamic stability. And let me just go to that thread for a second. So right now we have a bunch of monocultures around the planet. We've lost dynamic stability. Let's take a prairie as an example. A prairie can handle buffalo stampedes, drought, fire, insect infestation, tornadoes, what else? Somehow it survives because there are multiple niches that the environment fills to compensate for when one of those disasters comes along. We've lost that diversity now, so that we now are producing hurricanes and wildfires and tornadoes, et cetera. And because we are so destabilized, because we don't have the diversity of life to address the compensation needed to avoid these monoculture disasters. So dynamic stability is what we want out of life, and that requires us to participate with life on its own terms. So moving from restoration now to regeneration certainly includes restoration as a subset, but how do we rebirth that relationship? Because we'll go along, if we're lucky, we have a memory of 10 years as a society, if we're lucky. And So we come along, we restore a wetland, and then 10 years later, a developer comes along and wants to build an office building on it. Well, we don't need that office building. We don't need that wet. We don't need all of that wetland. So we carve a little away. And then we carve a little away in the future because we aren't rebirthing our relationship with life, which requires a continual process of practice, which is what indigenous peoples do. Basically, they would inculcate this understanding of life. It became very natural for people. It's unnatural for us in Western culture. So in order for us to regenerate our relationship with life requires us to actually, let's just take this a period of a year. Every New Year's, how did we do this year? Where are we screwing up? Where do we see new potential? And that assessment, if you will, adaptive management, is what's needed for human beings to actually participate with life on its own terms, because we've forgotten. So regeneration is a continual process of rebirth, birth, life, death, rebirth, birth, life, death, rebirth. And one other analogy, in a marriage, for instance, or partnership, you may have an argument with your partner, spouse, and what do you have to do about that relationship? You need to regenerate it. You need to rebirth it, or else you might as well walk away. So that's a very conscious process of regeneration, and it's no different working with the living systems that support us. Okay, I'll take a breath.
Uh, so one thing that when you talk about cultures, and you talk about this idea of regenerative relationships, I think of ancestral or lineage of ancestral lands, or people that come before from a native perspective. And so it's incredibly important when you use that office building model. The office building is going to be put, and there was land that was set aside, and it was reworked, and it blossomed into something, and then now that blossoming is cut in half. And so one of the things about the future is that there needs to be a respect of the past, or certainly a respect from a cultural point of view, what that past, the kind of meaning that past holds for the people and for the community. And I'm not sure if in your work, particularly when you have this wider range of participants, if those kinds of concerns from a tribal standpoint, a native or historical land standpoint come up. But if they do,
Very much so.
yeah, share those with us.
Yeah, well, people are part of the system of life. We aren't separate from it. So and what's really interesting in the projects we worked on around the world, we find that we start by looking at the geology first. And geology informs culture almost all the time. It's the parallels are remarkable. So when we're looking at place, the system of life in that place as a living organism, we're looking for repeating patterns. No different again. What does Rodney do in this situation? Oh, well, he kind of loses his patience. Or, you might say, well, okay, now I get to know that Rodney is sensitive about this particular issue. So I've picked up a pattern of Rodney that helps describe maybe not your essence, but your personality. So that cues me in how to engage with Rodney. It's important. Culture, we do this all the time when we people watch, when we date. That's what we're doing. We're assessing that we're navigating those relationships. So in a place, we start with geology, and we find out almost universally that geology informs. So, you're frozen there for a minute. Okay, here's a classic one.
No, you're saying geology informs, and then
I'm going to share with you a story about geology. So I live in New England, and we have done a few projects in New England, and one of the working for the Museum of Science in Boston. And when we work, we start out here in this larger system. So New England is kind of it's a place, right? It's a unique bioregion. And so what's the geology of New England, and how was Boston formed? Well, it turns out that when Pangea broke apart, 3.5 billion years ago, the Laurentian plate, the North American plate, and the African plate separated. Now, I may have my periods wrong here, but so hope your listeners cut me some slack. But nonetheless, this we know happened. It separated. A chunk of North Africa broke off, and the geologists call it Avalonia. And Abylonia was this big chunk of land floating in the proto-Atlantic for, who knows, a few million years, caught a magma wave and slammed into North America. Now, I'm going to really oversimplify this just to make the story shorter, is that one of the things that I noticed when I lived in Vermont as a young college graduate is that we couldn't get home on the weekends during leaf peeper season when the colors were out, because bumper to bumper traffic from New York coming up to look at the colors. We'd say, why don't they go to, we'd be at the bar, why don't they go to New Hampshire? Why do they come to Vermont? Grumble, grumble. Well, the colors are a little different in New Hampshire. Oh, yeah, it's kind of true. And then we thought, well, the politics is different in New Hampshire. The farming's different in New Hampshire. And we kind of listed it, and then we went back to drinking a beer, right? So we're working years later, working now in Boston, and find out that Apollonia slams back into North America, the Laurentian plate, and the division line between Africa and North America is the Connecticut River. So New Hampshire, if you know the state motto, live free or die, or the granite state. Vermont is a metamorphic state. Vermont marble, limestone, the farming is easy, it's bucolic. New Hampshire, you got to scrabble to make a living. You got to scrabble to farm. It's very few areas in New Hampshire are even arable. So it creates a different kind of personality, different kind of culture. Live free or die is the state motto, right? In Vermont, it's united in liberty. So you can just see, for me, that was just kind of this incredible aha that the culture grew out of its landscape. Well, now, yeah, why don't you?
No, I was just wondering, we talk about, and this is super fascinating, an aha moment for me too, because I spent so much time in Connecticut on the East Coast, in New England, and saw many of these kinds of divisions, but I never saw them as divisions until right now, or differences, I'll call it. I'm just wondering though, is when we think about landscape, environment that gives rise to culture, can that also come from an urban environment? Something that we actually build. And to me, that makes a lot of sense. Like New York City for me is different than the city of Boston. It's different than the city of San Francisco. It's a city though. It's that urban environment that is pulsating with something that's quite unique. And it's not necessarily the concrete or the asphalt or the building, although it can be those things too. There's some sort of essence there about its urbanness.
Absolutely. And Jane Jacobs, so you know her name?
Yes.
Okay. Well, Jane Jacobs did the same work in urban areas. So the classic story, this is her most famous story, is in Lower West Side in Manhattan. She was looking at neighborhoods. How did they work? And what she was looking for is the essence. Read Death and Life of Great American Cities. It's the same stuff we're talking about right now. I mean, she was out of control, amazing. So what she identified was that in this Lower West Side of Manhattan, the essence pattern was eyes on the street. That's how she termed it. Because without eyes on the street, without the old folks and the housewife in the apartments above looking down, the flats above looking down on the street and watching out for the wise guys coming through or the thugs coming through to protect their kids, right? The shopkeepers would keep an eye on the kids. It was a neighborhood of mutual care. And you come along, or I come along and build a LEED platinum bank building that has all the bells and whistles of green building and ignore that essence. We've just destroyed a social ecosystem. So it's the same.
It's the same. I'm just sorry to jump in on you. I just heard this story. It might have been pulled from the same source, from David Brooks, the journalist and op-ed writer. And he was talking about growing up in Chicago, and quickly he was saying that there was this little girl, probably a little younger than my daughter, and there was a man pulling on her, and it was hard to know if it was a stranger or her father disciplining her. But what happened is that the shopkeeper, the butcher, the guy from the grocery store, they all came out. There was eyes on the street, and he describes it really beautifully. But I'll just go to this point: is that social connection of eyes on the street not only had purpose, but it kept us connected. It wasn't surveillance, it was that we actually cared.
Right. Yep. Mutual caring.
Yes, that mutual caring. And so when you think about, some of the projects you're involved in and some of the projects that may be going forward, um, uh, how do you actually build in that mutual caring?
Yeah.
Let me just be real knuckle dragging about this. Is it how, windows face windows, or is it how a plaza or a piazza is positioned, or is it green versus built, or this versus that? I mean, how do you think about that in a way that, obviously with the community involved, that tries to really support that and bring that into a certain kind of becoming?
Yeah, that's a pretty granular outcome what you're describing, and there's nothing wrong with working on that. But to get there first, let me paint a picture. The typical developer comes in, or even government, in fact, a lot of government, in a very transactional way. We have a project that needs to get done. I've got a wastewater treatment plant that needs to get done. I mean, and I've worked on these. The municipality does not want to get the community involved because it's a pain in the neck. They're going to have different opinions. There's going to be somebody who doesn't want it, and we just want to get this thing built. So we try to sneak it by the community and eyedropper information to people, which is incredibly frustrating, by the way. And everybody knows it's bull BS, right? And they know they're being duped a little, but we play the game because the structure is about just we give you 5 minutes to complain, and then we say make so noted, and we go on to do what we want to do anyway. So no wonder government isn't very well appreciated because it's manipulatable. It's manipulative. So what we do is we say we have all these different perspectives, problem solvers, and let's say every city has people involved with climate change and habitat connectivity and security and mobility and gender equity. You just name all the isms, right? And there's literally hundreds of activist groups working in their silos on this stuff. But they're all going to complain about a developer coming along because the developers are destroying the city. That's an easy pot shot to make. NIMBYism always rears its head, not my backyard. So what we point out to people, and we're agnostic about the development as long as it's not directly influencing with the core functions of natural systems, but that's a whole longer story. But let's say in a city, developers coming along and people are all complaining about the development, and we point out the developer wants quality of life as much as you do. It's not in their interest to not have quality of life. In fact, that would be a stupid business decision. So let's get out of the way that the developer is your enemy. Now, the developer, Mr. or Ms. Developer, you have to stop thinking that you have the right answer. Because if you come in saying, look at this great project that, our architect designed, they're the greatest architects in the world, you're going to love this. No, they don't, because you've never consulted us in the first place. You've never actually showed respect for us as a community. So right away, the battle lines are drawn. The minute the developer says, look at this great thing, you've lost the battle, and you've lost years but you hire enough lawyers, you get it done. So it kind of works. What we do, and we work with developers who work this way too, is we say, let's get to know the community first and find out the aspirations, find out the essence of this place, and find out what makes sense to build. The only thing that we promise developers is we will protect your profit because you are actually you're taking great risk. But what gets built and how it gets built is a different story, as long as you're making a profit. And I've only had one city ever kind of react against that, say, yeah, of course the developer deserves a profit, just not telling us what to do. So what we do is we go into a community and we say, what is the potential of this place to be a healthy city again? This is not healthy now. What are we missing? What does it want to be? If we actually let this return to nature, what would it turn into? And how do we work within the warp and woof of those living relationships? So what we discover is a North Star for the larger system that we're part of, that we can all work towards. And you, Mr. Climate Change person, and you, Ms. Mobility, and you, beach erosion person or whatever, all can work on your specialties. We want you to be impassioned about what you're impassioned about, but all of us need to serve this potential. How do we work on our particular arenas in this way? And so we actually set up an aspirational form of governance parallel to the municipal governance, working in a way that actually people are in dialogue and working towards a common, deep common purpose. That is building a field. And that is the punchline for our work, is what happens when you get enough critical mass of people together, 50 or 60 people working this way, and it takes about a year before people start letting their guard down. And in these meetings that we hold once a month or once every 6 weeks, we're learning from each other. And somebody says after about a year, wait a minute, I didn't know you were working on that. We're kind of working on the same thing. Maybe we should collaborate. And that's when you're off to the races. And what we've experienced, so I'd like to say sustainability is a practice. It's not an episode. And so regeneration is a practice, and it's a practice of continual rebirth. And every planner around the world we talk to now recognizes that deep planning is a 5-year process. It isn't having a conference. It isn't having a change management weekend. Yes, those are part of it, but it's actually sitting down and being effective every month or every 6 weeks, having tasks that we're getting done, working towards this North Star that we set out for ourselves. And that begins to attract other people. I'll tell you, there was a project in Chile we worked on where the executive director did not want to talk to a couple of gringos from the States. He said, we know how it works, buddy. We don't need to talk to you. Well, after he heard from the small talk that goes around any city that, hey, these guys are doing, the mayor didn't allow her staff to talk to us either. So we had the mayor against us, we had the Chamber of Commerce director against us. The Chamber of Commerce director called up her client after 10 months and he said, Ricardo, I don't know what you guys are doing, but count us in. This is the first time the city's been able to dream in 30 years, because he saw that progress that was being made, even as slight as it was moving forward. The mayor called up a year later. She said, I get it. This is great. Count us in. We want to partner. So even though it's slow at the beginning, that exercise of respect and care, active caring, a form of love, if you will, is what draws people together. And then it's powerful.
That it's powerful, and I don't think I've ever met, and I'm sure our audience has never met, someone of your caliber and your practice that uses love, care, regenerative, systems thinking all together for the good, for the tangible good. Yeah, that's fantastic. I want to thank you, Bill. I would love to talk more, as I'm sure you feel. I'll have to conclude here, but I do want to ask you one final question, if that's okay.
Sure.
Yeah, if you were to leave our audience with, a thought or a picture of the potential that you're building, what would you leave them with? I think you've left them with many pictures, but maybe as a concluding thought.
Well, a few of them. I'm going to maybe take more time than you care for me too, but I'm going to go there anyway. So we talked about frameworks in the beginning, a living systems framework. One of the most powerful frameworks ever that I've experienced, and if I leave you with anything, it's this one, is the law of three. This comes from Gurdjieff, the Armenian mystic. It's been picked up on by a number of people. Catherine Bergaltz is an Episcopal priest, wrote a book called The Law of Three and the Trinity, the Holy Trinity. So something about three, we all know that. The law of three is all life can be seen as an activating force. You want to build a building, and a restraining force. Nature may not want you to build there. So how do you actually harmonize? Because nature harmonizes, it collaborates. If you accept death as part of life, which you have to do, you can't argue that one. But if you accept death as a natural part of life, then nature harmonizes everything. Even with the disasters, it's actually a process of cleansing and rebirth, right? What we do in our culture is we compromise. So we concede, right? Consider. So I give up a little, you Republicans, Democrats, heart, mind, quantity, quality, science, religion, right? We say, well, I'll give up a little perspective, you give up a little perspective, and we call it a day. And we think that's the height of political sophistication. That's another slower way to die, because we compromise, and we compromise again, then we compromise again, and we drive ourselves right into the ground. We have never seen it fail that if we give a client, if the client says, opens themselves up to trusting that something is going to emerge that will allow both sides to be better off than they were before. And I've got lots of stories about this. It happens. And so what I would leave with people is, anytime you have a problem, couch it in the terms of, how do we harmonize your perspective and my perspective? I have relatives who are extremely conservative politically. I'm extremely liberal, yet we find common ground. We work from the essence of the activating force and the essence of the restraining. Quite in alignment, actually. That allows for true dialogue to take place. And that leads to the idea of potential. Always work towards potential, not problems. And that's what I'll leave you with.
Thank you, Bill. Really, sincerely, thank you for your ideas, your time, and I look forward to continued conversations.
Likewise. Thanks, Rodney.